You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1. Welcome to Missed Apex Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Reddy, but my friends call me Spanners, so let's be friends. Today, we are catching up with some F1 news, answering some of your listener feedback, and we'll be talking to expert lawyers about the impending Andretti case that's been filed by the America government or something. Matt and Peter and Heather will explain that later. But for now, I'll just tell you that we are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind permission of our partners and patrons. We might be wrong, but we're first. I'm joined in the shed by Matt Trumpets.
Looking forward to some Dutch pancakes next weekend.
Because it's Zandvoort and the Dutch are famous for their pancakes?
They were really good when I was in Amsterdam, that's for sure.
So you went to one place in Amsterdam, they had good pancakes, and now in your head, like you can start...
Two places had good pancakes.
Right, okay. And you think that's ubiquitous enough for that to be your opener, that like, yes, Holland is known for its pancakes.
When I remember that I need an opener 2 seconds before you say my name, yes, I think it will do.
Because, you know, when you go to Amsterdam, that's what everybody thinks. Yes, let's go to Amsterdam where we can get pancakes. We're also joined by Chris Stevens. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Spanners. You know, I've been rummaging around in the Missed Apex mailbag for the questions, and I can't find any cease and desist letters for us, like some of our content creator friends have been receiving. So I think we've gotten away with it.
Okay, like just before the show, I was saying to Matt, whatever you do not mention all these cease and desist stuff that's going around from Formula One. So yes, they're having a little bit of a clamp down, and I'm like, don't mention anything. Just sit here quietly in the corner, and maybe no one will notice us.
Oh, that message did not get through to me.
No, it certainly didn't. But why don't we talk about the planned news item? So we've got a few things here. We've got the comments from Kyle Larson saying that he'd beat Max Verstappen in anything that wasn't Formula One or a Formula car, which I think leads to some quite interesting conversations. There's been a lot of rumors about a regulation change, Regulation 11.1.2, but you didn't need me to tell you that. So there's speculation about which team that will be, and certain people in the media fueling rumors that it could be an explanation for Red Bull's drop-off in form. And we've got a couple of great listener questions and some Haas news as well, all sorts. But let's start with the alleged Red Bull hack. But actually, Matt, Red Bull's not mentioned anywhere. FIA hasn't said anything about Red Bull at all.
No, I'm pretty sure it was Peter Windsor who mentioned Red Bull and looking at their drop in form. And this is a potential explanation for it, which, you know, if you have some very cool hip mechanism that makes your car faster and then you're forced to remove it, cough, cough, Aston, then, you know, sometimes you can see a subsequent drop in performance. But the reality is you can make an argument for any of the top three teams having used it. And I just feel compelled to point out before we waste the next 40 minutes arguing about this, that there's no proof that anyone has even actually run it. Someone could have just written a letter to the FIA and said, hey, you know, we're thinking about doing this thing. We don't think it breaks the regs. And that's all it takes.
Okay, but to be clear, we are going to spend some time arguing about it, just to be clear.
Oh, endless time. And it's going to be so fun.
It wouldn't be Missed Apex without a good old-fashioned argument about this kind of stuff. The thing that kind of still I'm wondering about is why we had at Spa a technical delegate. No, that's not the word. Technical update.
Directive.
What do they call them? Directive. That's the word I was looking for, Spanners. So yeah, so we have a technical directive regarding this kind of system, apparently, or like some sort of, you know, closing of these regulations about something that Red Bull is allegedly doing. But Red Bull's drop in performance was before Spa, before the last race before the summer break. So if it is on the car, did they take it off to try and get some experience of the car without having this on, knowing they have a huge lead in the championship?
Well, this is the big problem about all of these things, is that they're done behind closed doors. So It is not a crazy conspiracy theory if you say, well, the FIA have found something, they've changed the regulation, a team has had to stop what they're doing, but we don't hear about it. That isn't a conspiracy theory. So, obviously we've seen Red Bull accounts, Red Bull sympathetic fan accounts, and in fact a Red Bull team member, which we'll talk about later, coming out and rubbishing these claims and saying it's a conspiracy theory, but it's not. We've seen this a lot, and thing is, it's like wigs. You only notice the bad wigs. So with these secret agreements, you only notice the ones that ended up being not so secret. So for example, one team that was fined, they never told us about it. They never announced the fine, but the FIA books show 18 million euros, I think, or 18 million pounds fine to a team for breaking the rules. And then their performance dropped off a cliff. This was said to be a secret agreement, and we never got told the details. So they never meant for us explicitly to know there had been a fine. So we only noticed the bad secret agreements. So we think, me and Matt between us, we think we saw a technical directive and before the summer last season, and then we were speculating on who it might be about. And some people were hoping it would be Red Bull because of the dominance, but it was a different team whose performance dropped off the end of the cliff. So we go, well, in my mind, maybe that's Aston Martin. But it does make you think, well, how many secret agreements were actually done well and we never knew about them, or there wasn't a specific performance drop that caught anyone's attention? So these kind of things probably do happen all the time. So I just want to establish that, Matt. It isn't some crazy conspiracy theory that the FIA might take action behind closed doors.
No, they frequently do. And as you so rightfully point out, a big, easy way to fix all of this rampant social media speculation would be for them to simply publish the technical directives. So the technical directives are also, and you should understand this as well, they're not technically regulations until the stewards decide to apply them as an interpretation of the rules, or until, which is what happened here, I'm assuming, or until the actual rules get changed. Now, nobody knows if there was a technical directive. I didn't hear anything about it, but the story we're talking about starts with, I believe, someone on Twitter called Molly Marissa, an engineer, motorsport content creator, twigged to a change in the technical regulations that was approved for essentially the summer break. That's kind of unusual. And then when you see it's about the braking and you read the words, the immediate supposition was that someone had found a clever loophole to help with the braking, and it was a toy that the FIA had decided to take away.
Okay, well, let's read that. So the relevant regulation is, and thanks for crediting the content creator who brought that to people's attention. It was 11.1.2. Now, the old regulation said the brake system must be designed so that within each circuit, the forces applied to the brake pads are the same magnitude and act as opposing pairs on a given brake disc. So to me, I'm taking that as each circuit being one for the rear and one for the front. So basically, you can change the balance between the front and the rear, but those pairs must be the same. So magnitude meaning amount of. So there's the same amount of force for the brake pads. And so then there's a clarification now which says any system or mechanism which can produce systematically or intentionally asymmetric braking torques for a given axle is forbidden. Now look at that specific wording. Any system or mechanism which can produce blah, blah, blah is now forbidden, which makes me think that somebody has introduced a system or mechanism which can produce systematic or intentionally asymmetric braking torques for a given axle, Chris. That would be the reasonable conclusion from that change.
Yes, and so a brief history lesson. In like sort of 1998, 1999, McLaren had two brake pedals in their car that were for, each side, so that they could brake a little bit more the inside wheels, and that would aid the turn-in. And I guess what this is kind of now looking at in a more modern sense is a slightly more passive way of getting more brake force on the inside wheel. So if you're going into a left-hand corner, you want slightly more braking on that left-hand side just to help the turn-in.
Okay, so slight clarification, because I went and read the explanation on McLaren's site. The actual usage of it was mainly in high-speed corners, and they would use the what they call the fiddle brake in conjunction with the throttle to balance wheel speed across the axle, because obviously your inside wheel is covering less distance than your outside wheel. And the reason it got spotted by the photographer is that was causing the brake disc to glow at a weird spot. And then he got interested and took a picture. And then, well, there you go. You know the rest of the story. Here, what's fascinating is not only are we going to argue about what this mechanism is, because nobody knows what's been found, but there's even in the press an argument about which side it's being applied to. So very quickly, basic principles that even spanners will agree with me on. If you want to turn the car quicker, you want to add more braking to your inside rear wheel. That creates an oversteer moment. If you want to use it like a differential, or you want to stabilize the car on entry, then you might add it to the outside wheel. And again, since we don't know the mechanism, we don't know how it's employed, either is technically possible, but most technical people tend to think it's probably the inside wheel that's being manipulated here.
And of course, a lot of you will have seen Scarbs' diagram where he proposes a G-force sensitive T valve, which is basically like if you're slinging the car to the right, this little valve will get pushed over to the left, which will allow more braking force and braking fluid to the inside wheel. Of course, that is purely just speculation where he's posited, a theory on what kind of passive device would do this. But yeah, I think the regulation change feels like too much of a coincidence in line with Red Bull's performance drop. So that's a big smoking gun. And the F1 mech, isn't it? It's the F1 senior mechanic Callum Nichols, I think, tweeted that, and it's a fair point, that maybe it's rubbishing the achievements of the other teams that have caught up. But as we know, correlation always equals causation. And at the moment, these things are kind of lining up. So around mid-July, you can look at my tweet, there was rumors going around that Red Bull were on some kind of double secret probation. Then their form started dropping off. Then we get this change that is really, really specific of like, hey, don't do this specific thing anymore. It's starting to kind of line up. So I think the question would be, let's say a team has got what Scarbs has put up on his Twitter, a G-sensitive T-valve. That's a fair sort of premise to just start with. Let's say that's happened. Would that be classed as cheating? So Maria and Adrian in our Patreon live chat, hello patrons, think it's kind of like a DAS loophole kind of thing where they go, oh, sneak, oh, I see what you've done there. We didn't think of that. You can't do that anymore. I don't think it's that. I think if any team has this, McLaren, Mercedes, Red Bull, I think if any team has what Scarbs has posited, it's an out-and-out cheat.
Well, then why has it taken this long to get to this, point?
How long did it take Ferrari to get pinged? It took Ferrari a long time to get pinged.
Yeah, this is true.
They got away with that fuel flow for ages.
It's not as clear and obvious as the DAS system, where it was literally first day of testing, everyone went, what the heck is that? And the thing about like the DAS, it was all came down to the wording thing. Like, is it part of the steering system, right? And they said it was, when I don't understand how you can come to that conclusion really, but they let it drag out for the year and then banned it for the following season. I think anything that is, able to exploit the wording of the regulations, which is what is the job of every single F1 car designer to do, then you don't call it cheating. To me, we have to be really careful with the word cheating, because to me, cheating is Schumacher parking up on in Monaco in qualifying and bringing out yellow flags.
No. I've got to go.
This is exploiting the regulations.
Was the fuel flow thing cheating for you? Just doing more fuel flow than you were allowed?
Which fuel flow? The Ferrari thing?
Well,
the alleged Ferrari thing.
I think we're okay, actually, to be honest. So Ferrari doing, if Ferrari were indeed having a higher fuel flow than you were allowed, cheating, yes, no?
I need to go back on it, but it's, that's the thing. It depends how it's worded, doesn't it?
No, and so the Red Bull one was earlier where they had the flexible pipe, didn't they? So you could only have a certain amount of fuel flow, but they had a flexible pipe the other side of the sensor. So basically, the sensor would show they've got a certain amount of fuel flow, but the other side of the sensor, there was a flexible fuel pipe, so that actually when you needed the power, you'd built up more fuel, so you could have a higher fuel flow. And they were disqualified from Australia, weren't they?
Yes.
That was different. That was different.
Why?
They were disqualified for messing with the fuel flow meter itself, not for that that external pipe. The pipe on the other side of the high pressure pump is the one you're talking about. And this is a, quote, loophole that goes all the way back to Smokey Yunick and NASCAR in the 60s, using flexible tubing to temporarily have an overshoot of whatever the fuel flow is.
That's genius, though, isn't it? You look at Red Bull doing that, and you go, "That's just
and
brilliant."
they changed the regulations to account for that.
Okay,
and that's what we're looking at here.
So, is why do I think that this system, if a team is doing it, and if Scarbs has got it right, why do I think that's an out-and-out cheat? I think it is covered by the existing regulation. Now, obviously someone has changed the wording of it, and you have to go, well, what is the motivation for specifically changing the wording of it? But it says the brake system must be designed so that within each circuit, and let's treat the rear brakes as a circuit, the forces applied to the brake pads are the same magnitude and act as opposing pairs on a given brake disc. So the fact that it's saying opposing pairs, to me, is talking about one side versus the other. Now, this device obviously wouldn't fit that, because it would be sending different force to different parts of the circuit at various times. So that, to me, that ruling covers that device if it's the G-sensitive let's call it the Scarbs valve.
Right. And I will start with, you'll be very happy to know that under the technical regulations, you are indeed correct. The rear brake system is treated as one circuit in the technical regulations. But I think the problem creeps in that they didn't really specify what they meant well enough. And that gave some wiggle room. And if you look at how the wording changes, they talked about magnitude of the system. Now they're talking about specifically brake torques applied. So it's not enough to apply a force to the brake pads, but the effect of the brake pads has to be to apply the same amount of torque reduction either side of the axle. And I think that's where whoever was thinking of this or whoever actually did it found their loophole.
Would a safe rule of thumb be, if you've come up with something that prompts rewording of the regulations, then it's a loophole, not a cheat?
That's not.
I think that's fair.
That's not unreasonable, but that assumes good faith. So let's assume good faith from the sporting
It's all
body.
in bad faith, of course.
Hang on. I do have thank you for reminding me. I did want to make a small point here. We are arguing about angels dancing on the head of a pin because we are talking about technical regulations. Sporting regulations are very different. So it's important that if we drag examples in from the sporting side, they are thought about very differently than the ones on the technical side. Just a point.
Sure, but I think it's very obvious that before you start having arguments about, okay, what does this specific word mean in the legal case in 1847, those regulations are very, very clearly saying to you, the front brakes have got to brake the same amount and the rear brakes have got to brake the same amount. So it would be very weaselly to go, oh no, but you didn't put the comma in the right place. That wouldn't stand up in court, because we've been speaking to Brad's partner, who is a clever lawyer lady, and she was saying that in court it isn't like that. You can't have playground, all but any cars that you had in the safety car in Abu Dhabi, where they tried to argue that, yes, it says any lapped cars have to be let past, and they were like, but it didn't say all, any could just mean some. It's like, no, obviously not. If I say to my kid, pick up any clothes that are on the floor in your room, I obviously mean pick up all your clothes. And in a court of law, that kind of reasonable interpretation of everybody realized that that's what it meant would stand up. So I'm reading that regulation, and to me it's very clear. You have to have the same amount of brake pressure on each side. You cannot have an asymmetric braking thing, and I think if a team has been found to do that, they've been found to be cheating.
Thank you for making my point about the sporting regulations versus the technical regulations. This is a technical regulation, and a missing comma can entirely change what an engineer is allowed to do. Unlike your example of the safety car, which I agree with, by the way, where it is a common sense interpretation and what we are basically pretending is a court of law, even though it's the FIA. What I want to say is your use of the word asymmetric and torques is what is the important bit about what has changed. We don't know how this system worked. We have Scarbs saying, here's a way it could have worked. But if the force getting to the brake pads was essentially the same, and therein lies another tale, how exactly and to what degree are we going to measure this force? If whatever the mechanism was on the other side of that and changed the amount of torques being applied to each brake disc, then it would not have fallen afoul of that regulation, if it even existed, which we still don't know if it did.
I think the measurement thing is a really good point, because it could just be we're talking about such a subtle difference in the amount of braking force being applied to the inside wheel that even if you had a sensor on it, it might not pick it up. So, example from the Canadian Grand Prix qualifying this year, when Max and Lando set identical lap times, right? Because we do it to a thousandth of a second, right? Someone at the FIA has got the lap times of both of those cars to the 10,000th, and they know who was quicker. But we don't measure it for the sake of official results to the 10,000th, and we got the result that we got. Now, one of them might have been quicker and ended up starting behind them, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles, because that's what we measure it to. And it could be the same case here.
Please don't clarify FIA tomorrow and completely make this content irrelevant. By the way, we are going to do some kind of Zandvoort preview in the week as well, and get right fully back into F1 mode with a couple of shows a week, because I've been really, really enjoying that this season. Matt, go on.
Well, I just want to bring up one more related point, just a larger point here. We don't have to argue about it, but, you know, this is kind of my happy place, so feel free to if you want. Which is the accusation against Red Bull was made on social media by someone who might have insider knowledge or might not. But all performance is relative. What looks like a drop in Red Bull performance, except for at Hungary, where I think you can look at last year's lap times and see they didn't do as well. What looks like a drop in performance from Red Bull could easily be a gain in performance from McLaren and Mercedes, and especially Mercedes. Struggle. Suddenly the car turns and works great. I don't know. Do they have a magic device again?
Yeah, I know.
Maybe.
Look. If I wouldn't change. If it's Mercedes, I still think it's a cheat. I shouldn't have said comma. So a lot of lawyery people or people who know lawyers in the chat room are picking me up on that. I shouldn't have said comma. I should have stuck with my all versus any. But what I'm saying is, if the meaning is clear, you can say the meaning is clear. You can't play clever word games. It's not a Shakespearean play. Yes, if comma was the wrong thing, if you do the wrong number or the wrong decimal point, then yeah. But yeah, you can't just like change what the word magnitude means. So. What's interesting is arguing on this online is then I'm really fascinated. I'm not calling this individual out, but it's quite rare for the F1 teams to have a non-management person come out and sort of make statements. And so this F1 Mech, you can follow him. He's very proactive online, has done a lot of interviews, is an incredibly interesting guy. And I think his job is the power unit installation of the power unit trackside and sort of managing engine life and stuff like that, came out and said this is all BS, and has done that on several occasions. And so that kind of shuts down the argument online. So people are saying, well, look, you know, or in fact, somebody said to him, how do you know? How do you know better than Scarbs? And he goes, well, you know, I build the car, which is a very compelling case, to be fair, Chris. So does that just kind of shut it down? Because you've done PR. You've done PR for teams.
I have, yes. Would I say that every single person in a team knows every single detail about the car? Probably not. So I don't know. I would I like Scarp's theory. I've seen other people posting other theories, and I do think this is going to end up being one of those things we're never going to get real answers about. Maybe in 20 years' time, when Adrian Newey writes another book, we will maybe get an answer about it.
I spoke to a Teams com person about a month ago, completely unrelated to this, and I said,
what did they say?
Well, because we were having a chat, I said, you've got some people who've got like social media presences in your team, and his face. Face was like, oh yeah, he was like that, and I go, oh, but that's quite good, they're engaging, and he's like, well, he goes, what they don't realize is people assume they're a spokesperson for the team, and even if you put all my own views or whatever, as far as the team is concerned, as soon as that person has said it, that causes an issue for them. And he was just saying, well, we want to encourage people to, we can't just go shut up. But if I could, no. But that's the impression I got from him, that it was like, if that could just go away, please, that would be great.
Yeah, I fully 100%. I would be giving the same message to any team I was, working for at the same time.
But obviously, like if a team member coming out and denying it is proof, and that means there's definitely nothing happening, then every time that same person doesn't come out and specifically deny an allegation, that is also some evidence that that allegation is true. So, that's where it kind of gets difficult. Matt?
Well, yeah, I was just going to go on and say that if this team member had absolute knowledge that this was going on, their reaction is unlikely to have been what we actually saw on social media. And their general job does give them a higher probability of being aware of such a thing if it's there, although it's not 100% cert that even someone engaged in building the car, as we had this conversation, would absolutely know. But they seemed themselves convinced of this, because if they thought they were guilty, they probably just wouldn't say much of anything.
No, and let me do a call out actually to anyone who's been an F1 mech in the past who'd like to come and talk to us, because I'm fascinated by what various team members know about stuff, because I'd imagine it's quite compartmentalized, and we've had team members before in the past who've spoken to us, and it seems like they're guessing about the senior management as much as we are, because obviously they're massive organizations. But if you're there in trackside in the garage with your hands, with your guts in the car, you're going to be exposed to a lot more of that. But if you're an ex-team member, I'd love to know if your experience of like repair and logistics is similar to what I experienced in the military, because you have a choice. You go, do we bring a spare brake pedal, or do we bring all the parts to fix brake pedals out there? So if you're going to fix a brake pedal, actually repair it internally, you need different facilities, you need different skill levels, but you also need to bring all like 20 parts in boxes instead of just one part, which is a brake pedal. So you have to kind of offset that against the cost of returning things and having staff in different facilities. So I would just love to know, what kind of mechanical, technical access do mechanics at a track have? I'm imagining that they get mostly a system, which is a box that does a thing, and then they plug those things into the system. So they're looking at it at a system level. And as soon as something goes wrong, you take it off, you put a new thing in, and then you send it back. So I would be really, really fascinated to know how those levels of repair work.
I will provide my very limited insight into this very topic just now, which is that my understanding is that teams bring replacement parts for a number of significant areas, maybe not every single one of them down to like the brake pedal that you mentioned, but they also have the facilities to fix things on site to a degree.
Yeah, it will be decided on an assembly to assembly basis.
Yes. If something is completely and utterly wrecked, they'll say, we can't fix this here. We have to. And do you know what? It's the same with chassis as well. Like I've seen it where the car gets chassis damage on a Friday and they say, that's it, we're done for the weekend. This is not necessarily in Formula One, but it's in other championships where they'll say, we can't fix this here. So we're done for the weekend. We're going home. So there is a sort of a varying degree of it. What you've actually also made me think of, Spanners, with the whole inside of people who aren't senior managers, who aren't spokespeople for the teams, having an online presence, is that I would cheekily, as a comms person, set up an account, dress it up as somebody who works within the team, and then just have all these pre-approved posts going out. But it looks externally like it's a guy from the team being like, oh, and I think
what would you gain from
blah,
that?
blah, blah. It's a bit cheeky. It's a bit like how Gail wrote that ABCDEFU song based off a comment from her TikTok, but the comment was actually one of like her agents or something.
Okay, so you're controlling the narrative. I
Exactly.
like that, but making it seem like you're not. Yeah, I just find that stuff interesting, Matt.
Yeah, but speaking of narrative control, my last little issue here and deciding who or what might be behind this is, don't you think we'd have heard from Toto by now if there was really some evidence directly enough that Red Bull was doing something this cheeky?
Did we hear from...
silence speaks volumes.
I would
sometimes.
say, though, did we hear from Toto before the Ferrari things? So these things I think are done in the background. Go on, Chris. Then I think I've got one final point on cheating.
Yeah, no, so just one tiny thing on that is that there's a very real possibility that that kind of conversation has happened, but it's happened with Netflix cameras present.
Tune in, kids.
They've possibly got some sort of exclusivity to that, so that will come up in the next. So if the next season of Drive to Survive comes out and Toto, like last season, is having his whole, you got a problem, change your car with Christian moment, then we'll know that it is already happened.
Okay, so I've got 2 points. One is on cheating in general, and one is like what I think is actually happening here. I've got to say, I am a little bit compelled by the F1, the Red Bull mechanic, really like he's put his nuts on the line there on Twitter, on social media, saying, this is BS, nothing's happening, we haven't broken any rules. You go, well, that would be, you'd have to be quite sure. Do you know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't want to reputationally. He does seem to be someone who worries about his reputation, who is looking for a career in media. So I'm actually giving that a bit of weight, which is sort of disappointing because the most drama-filled version of it, wouldn't it be, Chris, is if Red Bull got caught with a asymmetric braking thing and they've been nerfed. That would be the most exciting narrative for the storylines, wouldn't it?
For the Netflix, yeah. For the plot.
For the plot.
As the Gen Zers and the Gen Alphas say.
And then I think that the biggest overall problem, though, is the lack of transparency. So the lack of transparency makes it seem like a holy crime, almost. So why not change the attitudes in general to these things into more poacher gamekeeper? So there's a lot of money washing around F1. Could they not increase their scrutineering? Could they not increase the access that the stewards and the FIA have to the cars? Can it not be a little bit more open so that it is genuinely a cat and mouse game? Because they are obviously trying to put the regulations to the edge. And as a team boss told us, Matt, if you're not cheating, you're not racing, or something. It was something along those lines. Which is
if you're not cheating, you're not trying.
And that was it. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. But it's true. Like, if you're not pushing the boundaries of the regulations, then you're leaving things deliberately on the table. So the nature of the sport is to quote unquote cheat. So instead of it being, oh, shame on you, and have to walk the streets of King's Landing naked with the shame nun behind you, why can't it be like, oh, you nearly got us with your asymmetric G-force lateral device. Oh, you cheeky little scamps. Go on, get rid of it. And they go, oh, yeah, you got us. Why can't it be more like that?
Well, at least internally, I think amongst the teams, it absolutely is. I've seen a few former team members comment on this, and all of them are basically like, I doff my chapeau. That's very clever and good for them. And now they'll have to think of something else. So I think amongst the team it is. But it is an interesting question why the fans at large and why the sport itself doesn't sort of capitalize on that on social media. Like, talk about how extremely clever it is, explain why it didn't break the rule specifically, explain why the rule had to be changed and what they're hoping to accomplish with it. I like that better too.
All right, why don't we move on? Okay, Chris, bit of a weird one, this one. Kyle Larson of NASCAR has said that he would be faster than Max Verstappen in anything that isn't a Formula One car. So I'll just read the quote. I think this was from like their press conference, but it's been quoted everywhere. I don't know who originally reported it. Sorry. There's no way Verstappen can get into a sprint car and win the Knoxville Nationals. There's no way he can go and win the Chili Bowl. probably right. There's no way he can go and win a NASCAR Cup race at Bristol. There's probably no way I can go and win Formula One at Monaco, but I think I'd have a better shot than him just because of the car element. So Kyle Larson thinks he's got more of a chance of winning Monaco in a Formula One car than Verstappen winning a NASCAR race. With a quote, "That's what gives me ease and confidence. They're like, I know I'm better than him, maybe not in an open wheel Indy car or Formula car, but that's one discipline. I think I would beat him in everything else." You can quote that. I mean, that's a huge claim.
The problem is there are so many different disciplines of motorsport. Does he think he's going to beat him in, grass racing or a hill climb or in a touring car, for example? Yeah, right. So the thing, there's been a lot of hullabaloo about the whole who's the greatest racing driver of all time debate, because a lot of Formula One fans very narrow-minded about it and they say, well, it has to be a Formula One driver, and then people who watch stuff outside of Formula One say you're narrow-minded, it's this guy you've never heard of because you don't watch anything other than Formula One. And some people say the debate is pointless. I say I love the debate. I think it's a great bar argument, right? So long as it's all in good spirit, right? Because it's not an argument to be taken seriously. It's like putting jam or cream on your scone first. No one really cares what you do.
There is your first mistake.
Yeah, I mean,
life and death, this argument.
Okay.
I know it is. I know it is online, but this is the real world.
Okay. I'm just saying, if you put your jam on first, just shut up. Just go home.
Yeah. Same.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, same, obviously. But no, I would disagree just personally with Kyle's remark that he has a better shot at winning Monaco in a Grand Prix car than Max does, particularly when he's talking about Max, who's one of the most versatile drivers.
Yeah, he's unlucky. This was my first thought, actually. If this had been 5 years ago and Hamilton was dominating and he said this with Hamilton, I think he's probably got a better case. But I think, Verstappen has demonstrated more versatility. I'll get down to that. I'll justify that statement later.
Well, you get the sense that when Max eventually gets fed up with Formula One in the next, week or so, and he goes and does WEC, or he goes and does IndyCar, or he goes and does just whatever he wants to, and he's going to be amazing at it pretty much from the get-go. But the problem, if we're talking about the best, then we have to talk about versatility, because even within, if we just isolate Formula One, for example, and we've got Lewis Hamilton, who is undoubtedly one of the greatest F1 drivers of all time, struggling with this current generation of car, the ground effect era of car, because it doesn't necessarily work for his driving style, and he's struggling to get the best out of this type of car. And we're still talking about Formula One, let alone when you start talking about 1,000 horsepower bricks with impossible, lazy, understeering NASCAR, horrible handling machines. And then you go and talk about, are we going to include motorcycle racing in this as well? Lewis Hamilton, actually pretty handy on a superbike.
Good point. I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah, no, you'd have to include that. So in this debate, though, the most interesting specific example is where I think it falls down, about him having a better shot at winning F1 at Monaco. Now, does he have infinite time to train and to learn all the systems and everything? Because, oval racing, I will not knock oval racing. There is a very specific skill to that. And like every inch of the track is like a corner, and the way it evolves and the way it's racing through the pack, it's outstanding. I've done a lot of it on the sim, and I even did the 2311 sim up at their place, and I was within a second of Bubba and Tyler, which may as well have been an eternity. They were laughing their heads off at me. I could barely exit the corners without losing the back end. Like, it's an absolute beast to handle. And then I watched their sim guys and drivers do it. So I'm not knocking that skill at all. However, the NASCAR steering wheel has one button, and it's for yelling at people. And so it's obviously a much more complex system. There's a lot more to think about just operating the vehicle. That would make it harder. Whereas, I imagine Verstappen could sit in a NASCAR, have a few points, like there's the go pedal, there's the yelling at people button, have a go, like good luck.
So I have a thought here, and I'm going to defend Kyle Larson. Because I think,
America.
first of all, I think F1 has a motorsport audience, and I think NASCAR has a motorsport audience, and I think they don't overlap in their Venn diagram a whole lot.
No, they
so
don't.
Number one, I think both NASCAR and Formula One know this. Liberty is an American company. I think we're starting to see we could probably share this motorsport audience, couldn't we? From both sides, from both camps here. It makes a lot of business sense. So number one, I'm going to bring up the possibility that someone put this bug in his ear, WW whatever style.
He's obviously
now. I forget.
Yeah.
Secondly, Monaco, with one condition: if you give him pole position, we saw Daniel Ricciardo win without an MG UK. Monaco is the only race he would likely win in a Formula One car if you started him in front. And that's why I think somebody might have had something to do with it. I don't know.
I think that's lucky. I think he's just picked the most famous Formula One race and then he's lucked into that point. But look, chat room, stop it. Chat rooms, this argument's stupid. It's too broad. It's like comparing pole vaulters and long jumpers. We know this argument's stupid. We're having it anyway. And Maria says, it's like saying who's the best musician between a trumpet player and a violinist. Obviously the violinist, right? Violin is such a difficult instrument that even people who can play it well sound terrible. There's no reward for learning to play the violin well. A trumpet has 3 buttons. And Matt, have you seen the amount of volume of whiskey Matt can drink and still play the trumpet well? How hard can it be?
You're welcome to try when you come visit.
Yeah,
Brad did. Ask Brad how his trumpet lesson went.
Can I just, my favorite thing about this debate though, when you see it online, is that everyone's talking about, it's Larson or Verstappen, and then somebody will just post a video of Shane Van Gisbergen in the Australian Supercars Championship doing what he does best.
Supercars is great.
And then I'm like, yes, him, 100%.
Or those guys, you know, the ones that have the jumps. I think that's in Australia as well.
Oh,
they're the big wheels.
It's the same.
It's like Supercars, but is it the same series, the same family?
No, it's not the same series, but they basically race on the same weekends, I think.
Oh right, yeah, and they've got those huge wheels and they launch over ramps.
Super trucks.
Yeah, super trucks. There we go. And then you've got rallycross. Rallycross is a whole skill in itself. And what's the one they do it in the infields in NASCAR where it's like dirt and road? It is rallycross. It's like rallycross. In my head, rallycross is from, like, I watched it on Trans World Sport in the 80s, but it's much more glamorous, the one they seem to do in America. Same sort of thing.
Speaking of, we're leaving rally drivers out of this entirely, and I think they might have the best argument overall.
Rally drivers, though, are insane. And do you know, like, have you seen those clips of rally drivers?
Insane and finish, right?
Yeah, but they'll like hit a thing, roll over, go down the side of a cliff, hit a tree, get skewered by a Yeti, and then it'll settle down and they'll go, okay, good, first gear, let's go. And you go, no, you've just had like a movie death-defying moment. Like, just please acknowledge it. So, of course, drivers will go and specialize in their different disciplines. But what we're talking about here is, okay, outside of their disciplines, which driver is more likely to win most series? Now, most of those series we've talked about involve a lot of turning in both directions and braking. So I would just argue that Verstappen, without getting into the iRacing argument, which people will poo-poo, just coming through karting and sports cars, that's going to give you the skills that will fit most motorsport. So I think in most motorsport, that's going to overcome. Kyle Larson's done 35 road races. I was looked up earlier, although people can argue with me. Obviously, we don't know our NASCAR particularly well. I just think he's onto a loser there because most racing series, unfortunately for him, will fall more into Verstappen's natural skill set that he's grown up with.
What you'll end up with is you're just going from car to car. You would make maybe smaller adjustments to your driving style, whereas, you know, going from road racing to ovals or from road racing onto rough surfaces, you know, off-roading, it's just three completely different ways of driving, probably, and ways that you would have to like mentally approach each of them as well. And so you can sit here and you say, well, let's stick them in a go-kart and then let's stick them in a rally car, and then stick them in a GT car, and and see who comes out, who accrues the most points out of all those things.
We've got to list all the series, and then one by one decide who would win that specific series.
Yeah, like a motorsport Olympics. But I will 100% agree with you on the iRacing thing, though, Spanners. And anyone who disagrees with this, I think, is just in the wrong court, because how many? What is it? 10,000 hours to be an expert at something. And when you actually think about how much real world track time you get these days, it's not a lot, especially, since we lost in-season testing. And so when you're just spending every single second, you're not at the racetrack doing laps and doing the craft, right? It's you're only going to get better at it.
So, people massively underestimate sim racing. And so I think there's a lot of guys now who would be able to transition from sim racing and then take that into the real world. And so we've heard from, say, Brad, who goes, right, if I go in a sim in that car, it gives me all the knowledge I need, braking points, rough turning points. I know how I'm going to attack the corner. And then when I get there, I'm just adjusting to, the physicality of the car and any sort of local lumps and bumps. But he goes, yes, that is absolutely great training, very specific and relevant. And he uses it for the Nordschleife, and he's gone and won class championships at the Nordschleife as well. So, they would find it relevant. That's not to say like my iRacing experience only wouldn't translate to the track, because I could get within a second of Brad on around Spa in an F3 car. If in real life I would be 10, 12, 15 seconds off if I could even make it round a lap, because I don't have that kind of physicality as a race driver and know how to drive a race car. For Max Verstappen, doing iRacing, eats, sleeps, up till 3 o'clock in the morning in a range of sports cars, I'm very confident that Max Verstappen is going to could go into WEC, into British Touring Car Championship, into Rallycross, and he's going to be up there. He's going to be Verstappen-ish level at all those events as well.
Yeah. I think the difference for you and me, Spanners, between the sim and the real world is suddenly you can hit things.
Yes,
and it will hurt.
No, it's 100%,
unlike in the sim.
100% it's fear. No, racing drivers seem to have this. They all park this could seriously damage and kill me. And they have that life attitude of, I could die tomorrow. Whereas I very much have this hobby isn't what, even in a go-kart, I think, I've got to go work on Monday. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, same.
Do you know what I mean? So, whereas race drivers don't have that. Sorry, Matt, I held you off for a while there.
No, I was going to say there's a reason I don't really race bikes anymore. And it's just because now when I fall off them, I would break things, and I don't need that. I want to bring up one point. One interesting way to look at this would be to just say, what are the total series? And are the cars more like stock cars, or are they more like open wheel cars? Like, we give each one, they're better at their particular discipline. And I think maybe overall, that might lean a little more towards the stock cars, because there's so many different types of GT series, which are going to inherently be more like stock cars. So that was my point.
I do still think there is a big difference between like a NASCAR, like a stock car, and even like a GT car, because I think GT cars are more, especially these days, starting to handle like prototypes, like actual downforce machine, closed wheel downforce machines. But that's just very different to a stock car still, I think. So I treat those as a different type of racing.
And then my last point is, and this was made in the chat room earlier, is this is kind of why they had the Race of Champions to begin with, isn't it? Since we're also talking about Brad.
Excellent. We're out of time for this portion of the show. So we're now going to go to a conversation that Matt had with Heather and Peter, talking about basically, are Liberty going to get pinged for the way they treated Andretti? We will gather back here in the shed midweek, but I won't say any more words. Matt will say goodbye at the end of that segment. Go and follow Chris at Chris on Racing. Go and follow Matt at MattPT55, and follow me. I'm the best one at Spanners Ready. We'll see you midweek, and for now, I'm going to hit the breakers and pass you over to Matt from the past.
Hi there, Trumpets here, and I am joined by the dynamic duo of digital lawyer Peter Wright and multi-jurisdictional law expert Dr. Heather Anson to talk a little bit about the Andretti update. Notice I didn't say upgrade. So welcome, Peter.
Hello.
Good to have you back, and welcome, Heather. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. I'll be honest, my memory has gone a little bit dim, which is probably mostly due to my age. But could you just sort of bring us up to speed on this narrative since F1 so ridiculously denied Andretti entry to the grid?
Right. So I believe what happened was at the governing body said go, but the people who have the commercial rights, they said no, you can't have this other team because you're not qualified. So Andretti, you can't come in because you're not qualified, which made no sense because the FAA said you're qualified. Liberty Media said they're not qualified. Well, then I think I remember saying before that's going to be a problem for them because Liberty Media is a U.S. company. Therefore, the federal government may just well have a thing to say about that. And it turns out, despite some other people saying, nah, they won't, they do.
I think so. It looks like Peter immediately wants to get himself in trouble and argue with you. Go ahead, Peter.
No, I'm agreeing. It's just to say for the benefit of our audience to sort of drag them back to sort of the key reason why this was so contentious was that rather cutting decision that was issued by Formula One when they said reasons why Andretti isn't going to be allowed to join the grid. And it wasn't in the nicest terms. I think that's why it ended up getting to the point that a lot of fans are quite exercised about the reasons that were given in terms of why Andretti shouldn't be on the grid. It talked about competitiveness. It talked about them not bringing anything additional.
They said basically, you're a crap nobody is what they said. You're kind of a crap nobody, so we don't want you.
Well, that's quite a thing. Yeah. That's quite a thing to say to Andretti and to General Motors at the same time. What I remember is there were letters both from the House of Representatives, for those of you who aren't in the U.S., that's sort of our lower house of what you might call Parliament if you were in the U.K. And also there was an investigation and a letter from the Senate. And at the time, this is a very classic thing. They have these investigations all the time. They do them to make their donors and big corporations feel better that they're being looked after and patted on the head by the government. But I'll be honest, I'm sort of surprised to hear that an actual investigation has come of this. So what do you think has caused that to happen?
The thing is how our lovely legislature, both Senate and the House, work is that it doesn't matter how many representatives are in your state or it's which state you're from and the importance of who they are in that state and the cause within that state, and two, what your seniority is considering what role you have within those. So the people who signed that letter were from states, GM heavy. I mean, we're talking Indiana, and people whose constituents they felt were going to be directly harmed by this. So it wasn't just people who it wasn't a political thing. They just they didn't like this, they liked that. And overall, it seemed to be picking up both sides of the aisle, as it were.
And I think, wasn't it the case as well that one of the people who signed the letter was also involved on a fairly powerful committee, which is now subsequently at the forefront of a lot of what's happening? So it's the point that these people, okay, these representatives may have been from those states with those interests, but it was the fact that they were also very experienced members
Yes.
of Congress and that they had the tools at their disposal to do something about this.
Okay, I want to ask a question, though, because I think this is an important distinction for our listeners to get. Obviously, being a USian, it's pretty easy. I understand this sort of inherently because I grew up in this world. But a lot of people were talking about, well, what could a Senate committee or a House committee do anyway? But the Department of Justice is very, very different. So suddenly it seems like the stakes might be a little bit higher because the Department of Justice is involved. Is that correct?
Correct. That's absolutely correct. So what happens is that Department of Justice can pick up cases of their own, but they are part of the executive branch, which is entirely different. They're the ones that go out. They file lawsuits against people. And if you want to know how often they take this antitrust stuff seriously, just go on to Department of Justice antitrust lawsuits database, and you'll get hundreds of cases that have been brought by them. They are the branch that brings these cases. They are the federal government's suing hand. They can do civil cases and they can do criminal cases. The House and the Senate can't themselves bring those. They can only do that sort of in-house. But what they can do is do some of the legwork. They're sort of like a little bit like detectives in a police department. They can go looking for something and go, that looks interesting. Let's take a look at that. But then they have to hand it over to the DA, to the district attorney, the people who sue. They have to hand it over to them to do it because they themselves can't do anything.
Okay. And now the question I'm going to ask is because I know this, having occasionally served as a juror, generally from the criminal side, they don't like to bring cases criminally that they're not about 99.9% sure they are going to win. Is it the same with the antitrust thing? I mean, if I'm Liberty, do I have a real reason to be kind of concerned here? At least that the judgment might go against me, even if it can't change the outcome I want.
I would be worried, yes, because again, the speed at which this transferred from just a legislative investigation to the Department of Justice. Department of Justice definitely saw something here. And when you're looking at it from my side of it, I see a real issue here. I'm pretty sure the teams didn't want them to come in because of valuations and prize money splits and things like that. However, they didn't say that. What they said was it was because they weren't competitive and weren't going to bring anything. That was so flimsy. Nobody took that seriously. So if they could have come up with something that was even credible, then we wouldn't be here. But they don't have a credible reason for it. So the only other reasons you can come up with are the ones that violate the antitrust laws. Whether they bring a criminal case or a civil case is still up for grabs. It depends on just how serious it is.
Yeah, it was just to sort of say that we started to just brush there on the sort of, well, what could the implications of this be, and what are the sort of the teeth that could be used. And I just wanted to sort of draw us across. There's recently been a very big, what in the US you're referring to as antitrust, what in a lot of other countries we call a big competition case against Google, that I'm sure quite a few listeners may have heard of. That actually hit the US last week. It was in the federal court. But the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, made quite an interesting statement that I think almost applies equally here to what's going on with Formula One. Because basically he turned around and said this decision is a historic win for the American people. That's his quote. He talked about the fact that Google had abused its dominant position. He said, no company, no matter how large or influential, is above the law. The Justice Department will continue to vigorously enforce our antitrust laws. And this week, on the back of that judgment, they're now saying that the US government might actually force Google to break up, to sell off different parts of Google's empire.
Does this mean my search is going to work again? I'm so excited.
That would be amazing, right?
But it's a big statement of intent to say, look, we have these US antitrust laws, and we are not afraid to use them. And I think that's putting a fairly big stake in the ground. And if they're willing to go after Google, they'll certainly go after Liberty, which isn't as big as Google. Well, albeit it is very, very big. But it's just basically saying no one's too big. We will come after you if we think that you are abusing your position.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question, and we've had this discussion many a time about the EU agreement with Formula One that split the regulatory powers and the commercial rights holding off. How does that play into what the US is doing, and vice versa? What is the EU going to make of this? Because they sort of seem to have set themselves up as the arbiter of Formula One, because it is, a European-based sport, although I note that the FIA did move some offices to Switzerland to avoid that in the future.
Indeed. And I think this is the key thing here, in that 25 years ago, when that decision took place and there was a huge, long-winded EU investigation, it went on for years. There was a lot of jockeying. This is back when, in the days of Bernie Ecclestone's Formula One, back when all of the very relevant companies were registered at Companies House. They were largely UK-based, if not necessarily UK-owned. But it meant then that with the UK as part of the EU, the European Commission got involved, lots of investigations, big settlements, big changes to the way the sport was run, putting the commercial interests solely in Formula One group, and regulatory issues with the FIA, which is quite a common settlement when it comes to professions and industries in Europe in terms of how governments like to see things split. Nonetheless, that it's very much a case of that was then, this is now. We now have Liberty as a US corporation, majority US owned, with US management, largely US investors. And therefore, you've got this much greater role of the federal government when it comes to oversight. The EU could get involved. The question would be, does it want to? At the moment, the EU is very heavily taken up with its new Digital Markets Act when it comes to competition. It is looking at the activities of, for example, big US tech firms. But it almost suggests, does it have the bandwidth to get involved in another protracted examination of Formula One? Or is it rather going to piggyback on the back of the work that might be taking place in the US? And interestingly, I think it is likely that the Europe will piggyback on the back of that Google decision I was just telling you. So similar thing there, I think, could happen on this. Watch what happens in the US and see the same thing then being enforced in Europe.
Yeah, and I think they have a good example of, we've tried to go after corrupt or bad things happening in sporting regulators, and the U.S. has found really good ways of doing it. Think FIFA and the parrot keychain in the middle, and the IRS going after them and taking down corruption in FIFA. The U.S. government has a pretty dedicated way of doing this. So, yeah.
You're a lawyer, so I'm just not going to add the word alleged there. I assume you will if it's needed.
There have been historic cases of people paying off top people. So I'm not naming anyone now. I'm not saying anyone now is doing that. I'm saying it has happened.
It's good to be a historian, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
So if I'm getting this right now, what you're basically saying is what we might be seeing here is either a negotiated or just a recognized tag team. Like, oh, the U.S. has picked that up, so we can just let it slide till they finish, and then we can use their facts they establish if we feel like we need to add anything to it.
Yeah, and again, this is almost like the relationship between the legislature and the DOJ. If they're not sure if there's a case and they're not looking at it, they'll let the legislature do the legwork first before they take it up. And they take it up. That means it's serious. They've let them do a bit of the work, and now they're taking it on. Then that's what essentially Europe is doing, I think, now, letting the US, who is quite good at this anti-competition or antitrust law.
I think that's absolutely right. And also, I think more broadly, from a political perspective, again, people might look and say, well, hang on, there've been issues in sort of the last 10, 15, 20 years where, the European Union has set out one path and the United States has set out another. And sometimes it's been a case of each, the European Commission and the US government biting lumps out of each other and disagreeing on their positions. But I think certainly since 2022 and the sort of very different global situation we find ourselves in, I think there's been a general agreement that generally Europe and the US want to find, there's more that they agree on than they disagree on. I think there's a general agreement that they shouldn't be spending their resources biting lumps out of each other. And therefore, there tends to be more agreement. And I see that in a lot of the work we do around data sharing, data transfers, that there is a general wish to sort of find harmony in with regards to different standards in the US and Europe. And I think that will mean a sort of following each other's leads on issues like this to ensure that, for example, business doesn't face massive barriers when it's looking to conduct business on either side of the Atlantic.
Okay, so I have a question. I have a dual question for you, since there are two of you. First question is, you are both lawyers. So that means theoretically arguing either side of this case should be a possibility. And we're talking as if it's a done deal, they're going to lose this case. But realistically, if you had to defend it, do you think Liberty could make a case for itself? Like if I was asking you to establish probabilities or odds of the DOJ success here, granted their initially published reasons are pretty weak, but do you think you could find some better ones for them? And what do you think the outcome, what are the probability that they would win or lose, essentially? That's one. The other one, which I think ties into it and is my bigger question, is timeline. You may not have noticed because you're over there across the pond, but we do have potential election issues coming up, which means we might have a different leader in the Department of Justice who might feel differently about this case and tank it. So what would the timeline be for this case being brought? And would it predate the new president, whoever they may be, being sworn in?
I can answer that first bit. I think the basis of that will be, and it is actually that argument that's already in the public domain. So the basis of the rather aggressive letter that was provided earlier in the year, which I think, scroll back to that podcast from Joe Sayer, which sort of went through the position on that, is that I think Liberty feels very comfortable on the basis of the legal advice it's been given, which clearly led to that letter being rather rude about Andretti Cadillac and saying some rather unpleasant things. They clearly felt that was the argument they had to advance, and that is very much, the area of law and they've parked their tanks on, and that's where they will seek to defend it. And furthermore, I'll sort of open this up to Heather to then go into part two of the question. But we've got the position here certainly from the current DOJ, and then depending on the outcome in November, don't forget who turned up in the paddock in Miami and went around McLaren. So I think this would be my view is this would be a fairly major issue that a government of either persuasion would want to look at, in particular going back to the fact we talked about the fact that there's kind of agreement in Congress on this, depending on regardless of the electoral outcome, that I think you'd end up seeing that it's still something they want to go for. But I'm sure Heather's got a more nuanced view on that to take than mine.
I thought from the beginning that they were taking bad advice, which I say the highest paid lawyer. I know very, very high paid lawyers in the U.S. who give very bad advice. So that is happening. However, if they actually get very, very good attorneys who are used to defending antitrust cases, two things can happen. One, they could actually find a good argument, which they haven't provided yet, but they could find one. They could find one. And two, they can stall it long enough to do what I think is one of the reasons why that's holding this up, which is the Concord Agreement expiring. If the Concord Agreement expires and they don't feel like they're going to win, then and things get changed and the values are different, and they might be willing to then bring them in and go, okay, they won't say it, but we were drawing this out so that it would be a better deal, which is a very real possibility. Even if they thought this wasn't a winner, they may be willing to spend money to drag it out for a long time until it is a winner.
And that would be to do with one of the issues there would be the anti-dilution fee, which is, Matt, is something like $400 million you've got to pay to get on the grid.
I think it's 200 or 250, and I think they want to raise it to 750 for the next one. So it seemed to me that if you're going to make a real argument economically, the only real argument is adding an extra team potentially dilutes the value of the currently existing teams. But I also find, from just sort of a numbers point of view, it's a very dodgy argument to make, because value is always what someone is willing to pay in the moment. So with or without a team, that value will go up or down, and assigning causality to that specific action seems problematic. But I'm neither a lawyer nor a mathematician nor a statistician, so I could be very wrong about that. But let me drill down a little bit more on timeline, because one of the thoughts that I'd had was, if this turns into an act, so am I right? This will turn into an actual court case, which will either be civil or criminal if they decide to file.
Correct.
And if it does, what do you think the timeline is when we will find out if they are going to file, or if they're going to say, well, we've done the best we can, but there's not enough evidence for us to go forward?
But so just on that, just going back to our example of the fact that this case against Google, that was originally the case that Google was sued in 2020 by the US Department of Justice, and we haven't had that judgment through until August of 2024. And even then, we still don't know what the actual remedy will be that the court comes up with. We'll have to wait and see what comes out in the coming weeks. So, yeah, the wheels turn slowly, but you might get quite significant action at the end of that. But bear in mind Heather's point about, is this all designed to sort of slow roll it into that new Concord agreement, a new set of regulations, the next iteration of Formula One, when the walls that Andretti would have to breach will be commensurately higher, more money they'd have to put in, and indeed a new and even more complex technical regulation set. So that could indeed be the ultimate aim here. We wouldn't be looking at a judgment coming through in 2028, 2029. It's more designed to sort of get them enmeshed in the steps of litigation to then get to that point that Heather was describing.
Yeah, and a case would more than likely end up with Liberty Media having to, if it's slow rolling it, which was my prediction all along, and they do eventually let them in, but make them work harder for it and pay more money for it, or do something, some back dealing that's going on that we're not privy to. If they've already been let in by the time, the case can still go forward and Liberty Media can be fined after the fact for not allowing them in.
Okay, so Peter, I'm going to ask you as the only official non-U.S. voice on this segment of the show, how is this playing in what I guess I can't call Peoria because you're in England, but what is is there a sense amongst the legal community over there as to the seriousness of this and or just the general F1 community? Because, I know how we take it over here, but.
Yeah, well, I think within the legal community, it's very much they're sort of looking very much at thinking, wow, this is the view that's been given from these highly paid lawyers and big commercial law firms, so surely they must be right, shouldn't they? But I think the more this goes on, the more there's the view of maybe they're not. So I think that the more it's looked at, the more that there might be cracks in that position that's been taken. I mean, just look at the fact that there was a big point made earlier about, Andretti Cadillac wouldn't be competitive. Really? Well, if that was the argument, why isn't there a trapdoor in Formula One that says that teams finish at the end of the year that aren't competitive leave? I mean, Sauber would be sweating, wouldn't they? Did Williams, after a couple of years finishing on, did we say, you can't be in Formula One anymore because you're not competitive? Or was McLaren when they were finishing at the back of the field last year at the start of 2023? Did it say, you're not competitive, you can't turn up? Well, look, they were not competitive in the first few races of 2023. Along comes an update, and sure enough, they're at the front. So I think the point there is that a lot of those sort of issues that were raised are a bit nonsensical. I think that feeds through when you're saying, well, what's the view of Formula One fans? I think that voice has been is what Spanners has often covered when he's been involved in these discussions, is a sort of certain level of incredulity that we'd like to see more teams, we'd like to see more competition, and just because a team might not be based in the motorsport Silicon Valley of the UK doesn't mean it shouldn't be given its shot. Audi's going to have a go. Who knows what's going to happen, but they're going to have a go. That's you have the right to come in and do that. Shouldn't Andretti, American royalty, have the chance to have the same chance?
Yeah, the other thing that goes against that whole they wouldn't be competitive thing is that the regulations, even though it hasn't needed to be used for a very long time, the regulations already cover for a car or a team or two cars who cannot safely race because they're not up to scratch.
You're talking about the 107% rule in qualifying.
In qualifying,
One of the things that struck me, like if we're going to talk about competitiveness, is it was in one of the letters they said, and frankly, if we look backwards, half of the teams on the grid haven't won a race combined in the last 4 years. And in the 23 season, there was only one winner other than Red Bull. So I think you're correct. That does seem to be a particularly weak argument from
seemingly a weak
Formula
argument
One.
made by those who don't necessarily understand the sport. That's why that suggests that's come from lawyers who don't understand it. Say, oh, well, this is one reason. Well, really? Doesn't stand up to scrutiny by people who have a vague understanding of where the sport's come from and where it's going.
I would say that sounds like a plausible argument. Let's take a look at this. Let's stress test that before we actually do something disastrous with it. And that may have been the case where they trusted that was a reasonable argument in Formula One.
Yeah, and certainly nobody is perfect. I think I was struck by two things specifically. I found the text of the letters that was sent. One of them was, it seems like they really were banging on the idea from a GM point of view that foreign automakers were denying GM a chance to participate in a series that is used for marketing cars worldwide. But I think my favorite was anticipating the American team and Haas already existing. Basically, they say, well, it's owned by an American citizen and has a base here, but its cars are pretty much made by Ferrari, and that did make me laugh a little.
I think there's almost a desire in some quarters to look at the example of, I'm pretty sure I'm going back here a little bit, Lola from 1997. That's the team that, when they entered, even though they had a motorsport heritage, making, funnily enough, really good chassis for what was IndyCar at that time, when they came in, they were the reason for that 107% rule being introduced, which was basically we don't want cars like Lola tooling around 5 seconds plus off lap time and forming mobile chicanes in Formula One. So that's where that 107% rule came from. And it's almost an assumption that, that's where we think Andretti will end up. I don't think the example bears any comparison when you think of the resources that we know Andretti is already committing to this project and the people that are already being recruited that we know are working on the technical side of it. That it doesn't suggest that they would have the problems in terms of budget that, for example, Lola had back then, even though the sport really doesn't, it's now so different compared to what it was then. And okay, you do need more resources and more people, but Andretti is showing that yes, we are committed to doing that. So it really is getting to the point that example doesn't work. But, and I don't mean to be a conspiracy theorist in any way, shape, or form, but in terms of wild speculation,
no, hang on, I just got to buy some more shares in tinfoil here.
Well, if anyone is on sort of motorsport meta Facebook, and you're a member of different groups, it's funny how I keep getting lots of posts from people reminding us about the Lola story. I remember not long ago there was the front page from, or the front page of the news story from Autosport from 20 years ago of I think it was Andrew Benson talking about how the collapse that had just happened and almost regurgitating it for the benefit of a modern audience. And it happened again this week that it wasn't like it was an anniversary or something, but it's just this deliberate pumping out on a lot of the fan-based social media from certain quarters, almost to sort of say, look what happens when a team that isn't well-resourced comes in and how embarrassing it is. You wouldn't want that, would you? And it almost seems like that almost seems deliberate to me, but I'll take the tinfoil hat off.
I think what's interesting too is that there's the impression that Andretti is somehow behind the DOJ's, the wind in the sails of the Senate and House investigation and then transfer to DOJ. And I don't know genuinely whether it serves them, given the time it takes to run an antitrust case. The only thing it would serve is to help put pressure on backroom negotiations. People have said, if this is such a problem, why isn't Andretti not sued themselves? Well, that goes to, actually the understanding of antitrust cases themselves is Andretti is not considered the one harmed in this. Andretti is the unfortunate demonstration of an antitrust law violation, but they are not considered who's harmed in an antitrust case. Who's harmed in it is the F1 viewership, the F1 fans, those who, in this type of case, there are
The
different
American
cases.
public, in other words.
And the American public, their constituencies, which is why the House and Senate took it up. Their constituencies were being harmed. They weren't being given the opportunity to have this team, and that it somehow harms their benefit by not having it. So that's why it's a DOJ level case.
That harm is illustrated by the fact that in the most recent statement, it said, 1 million Americans are tuning into each F1 race, which is a comparatively big market in terms of US television audiences. You've got 3 F1 races now taking place within the United States. More than no other country is hosting 3 Formula One races. I think when you're sort of looking to establish that harm, F1 has established itself in that US market in a very, very big way just in the last couple of years. So I don't think it is a particularly great leap to then say, well, actually, this is now a growing televised spectator sport for US consumers, let alone those who are actually going along and spending, if you look at Vegas alone, quite a huge amount of money to enjoy the product. And obviously, Matt has first-hand experience of what it's like in Miami as well.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I'm going to ask the question, like, technically, little old me here is the victim in all this. And I appreciate my government going to bat for me against them big, bad monopolies and anti-competitive practices. But if I had to guess, based on what I saw, would I be too off base in thinking that while everyone's looking at Andretti, that it was probably GM that might have been putting its thumb a little more on the scales behind the scenes?
Well, whenever I do that, I think what is either the benefit or the perceived benefit of the person putting their thumb on the scale there. And I suppose I can see a benefit to GM doing that, in that they are not getting, even if it's not Andretti, they're hoping that this eventually gets them recognized in a team in Formula One.
Okay. And I will also say, in case people aren't aware of it, the new headquarters for Andretti Global is also going to be in Indiana, and GM is in Michigan as well. So the combination of the two is where the majority of political support came for referring this investigation.
Which is why I knew it was serious.
And I do want to ask you about one more thing, the thing that we haven't talked about before we get to Formula One in schools. We'll get to that, I promise. The thing I want to ask about before we move on is about settlements. Oftentimes, I know, like SEC and stuff, they'll say, we've settled this matter, blah, blah, blah. Is a settlement a realistic option for this? Is this all just sort of, again, like, we'll slap them across the face with a glove and and see if we can get them to come to some sort of reasonable settlement with Andretti to get this thing off the ground?
Well, settlement is definitely something that they could do if Liberty Media really felt that this was a problem. Interesting thing with antitrust cases is you can have pre-trial settlements, just like any other case you would think, or in criminal cases, a plea. But usually the settlements come after in antitrust cases, because you've decided that they have violated antitrust. Well, now we need to settle on what the damages are. The remedy, yeah. So the settlement is the damages phase of it. Formula One fans in the U.S., if you want to bring a class action suit, cool. I'm sure I can find you a lawyer that's willing to take that on.
Yeah, no, it was just with regards to, we were talking now about the base in Indiana, and the fact that GM and Andretti would have bases there. But I think also we need to make the point that they will also have a base at Silverstone in the UK,
yes,
which will probably be very much the sort of tech base where a lot of those tech staff recruited from the Silicon Valley of motorsport in the UK will end up working. And again, I think that suggests that they've actually thought a lot more carefully about making sure that they can benefit from the skill and the expertise that's already here in the UK by providing that UK base, without saying, if you want to work for us, you've got to move across the Atlantic. I mean, we know that apparently just moving across from the UK to Italy is a bit of a bar for many people, or indeed going to Cologne to work with Toyota was a problem 10, 15 years ago. So the point is that they have thought about this very carefully. And again, I think it gives the lie to that idea that, oh, they're coming in, they don't have any idea what they're doing, and they won't be competitive.
You're going to regret saying this, because now I'm going to ask you, does this open up, if we're talking class action suits, does this open up the UK government, for example, saying, well, they're going to hire how many people, they're going to spend how much money building stuff and enriching this community? Does this maybe bring the UK government into this issue as well?
Probably not. And I think, if anything, that you could get more attention from the UK government when it comes to the UK Competition and Markets Authority. The competition regulator might take a look. But there, again, the wheels turn more slowly. And then there's the question of, well, would they want to get involved, looking at what would probably end up being looked at? Okay, there would be an economic interest in terms of the UK, but would they look and say, well, actually, this is more of a US domicile corporation, and therefore we aren't necessarily going to get involved, because we don't think that Formula One would necessarily be bound by the decisions that we might bring forward. So, as I say, given the limited bandwidth, they might think, well, should we therefore spend our resources on that when there's arguably more pressing things that we need to worry about?
Yeah, that legal question of jurisdiction. Do we have jurisdiction over this matter?
Yeah,
Why the
may
US...
have done 15, 20 years ago, but now?
Not so much.
All right, then. Well, before we say goodbye, why don't you update us on the latest goings on in F1 in schools? Because I know that a lot of our listeners are very interested in this program, and we've even seen some people go and volunteer as a result of you being on.
Very happy with that. Well, Peter can talk about generally what's going on, and I can tell you about the team that I've essentially adopted, which...
So yes, Heather and I were judges on the F1 in schools at both the regional and national finals in the UK earlier in the year. And fascinating competition. Great to see how it works. Great to get involved. I know that people who listened to the contributions we made on Missed Apex earlier in the year then did come forward and actually put themselves forward as judges in the competition. It was great to meet a few of them at the national finals. I think the thing is as well, it's always great to then support some of the individual teams. And you've got teams from across the UK, all three nations that were competing. And this is a massive global competition. So if you're in France, if you're in the US, if you're in Italy, it's always they'll certainly need judges to take part in the same way, but also the teams need support. Even the ones in the primary school rather than the secondary school competition. So literally those who are sort of 8, 9, 10 years old in the sort of junior competition. It's great to support them, give them a little bit of money, give them a little bit of resources, as well as the secondary school competition. So we're at the point now where all the national finals have taken place around the world, and we're going towards basically the finals of the global competition. So the national finals, each one sends through a couple of winning teams to then the global final competition. That's taking place in Saudi Arabia. So therefore, you've got winning teams from around the world who are now trying to get the money together, because of course they have no money to do this. How do you get to Saudi Arabia? It's very, very difficult. So they are trying to now raise money for things like being able to fly there, and then hotel spaces and things. So sometimes those teams, they'll sort of reach out and might get help from airlines or hotels, but not all will. And they'll have a target that they're trying to achieve in terms of sponsorship. And you'll appreciate that for some teams, that's a real financial challenge. And I'll now pass over to Heather to talk about a team from Yorkshire, where we are in the UK, that is trying to get to those global finals.
I just adore these guys. They got on the podium. They're from Scarborough, which, unlike the Simon and Garfunkel song Scarborough Fair, not a very prosperous place. In fact, one of the things that kind of got me is when I was judging verbal presentation. This is before the awards, that had nothing to do with why they got in the finals, but they have to describe what they learned and what they got from Formula One in schools. And one of them in particular said that I now know that I can go beyond Scarborough. Scarborough is a place where you feel like you don't have any choices. You don't have anywhere to go. You feel like you're stuck. And I'm sure there loads of Americans who understand that feeling as well. And people around the world, they feel like they're stuck in their little town. And Scarborough's like this little town these kids felt stuck in, and now they see the world of Formula One, and they've traveled, and they get this chance to go to the world competition, but they are coming from an area that doesn't have a lot of money to throw at it. And I think they're the youngest that made it through. They are just freaking adorable. I love them. They are really good at reaching out to try and get more help. They've done all sorts of little things, and they're trying to raise money. I would love to get them to do a video or something and kind of get that here on Missed Apex, so that people can see and maybe help them out just a little bit, if that's possible. But they do show what Formula One in schools is supposed to do, which is introduce Formula One to people who wouldn't know about it otherwise, to also show that it's not just about the racing, it's not just about the mechanics, it's also about, getting the money and marketing and team management and organizational skills. There are people who thought, I went into this for the engineering, but I really like project management, or I really like the marketing side of it.
Well, yeah, it is. There's a lot more to it than I think most people realize. And it sounds like a fantastic way to get people excited about it at an age where it can become something that they do more than dream of, but can actually work towards. And we will have links, I will say, in the show notes below. But before we say goodbye, Peter, where can we look for you? Where can we find you? Social media and or your big professional platform?
Well, just in terms of, I know that you said you will have the links there for Unity Racing, but just for those who are listening, you might be driving, you might not get a chance to write this down. They are on X, formerly Twitter. Unity Racing is at Samurai Racing F1. Or for those of you who are on LinkedIn, please just search for Unity Racing and they'll come up on there. And you can just see some of the things that team are doing to try and fundraise. I think they did like a sponsored car wash a couple of weeks back. They're doing loads of things in the community just to raise awareness, trying to reach out to local businesses and just trying to do what they can to be able to get on their journey. So, but that's one of the things that all of these teams have to have a social media presence. So then it's a great way of entering in and seeing what other teams in your own countries around the world might be engaged in as well. So just sort of search under the hashtags on F1 in schools and that. And then in terms of what we do, I'm on at Digital Law UK on X. Also, you can find Digital Law on LinkedIn and on Facebook, and I think on Instagram as well for those who are on there. And my name is Peter Wright. So please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. A surprising number of people from Missed Apex have connected with me on LinkedIn. So please do.
I don't know why we might all need lawyers, but there you go. And Heather,
I'm like, I don't do law. Well, I do law, but I don't do. That's part of what I do, but it's not a majority of what I do now. It's around the complexity of stuff. So I am Anson Evaluate. I believe someone said I had an X or Twitter account. I'm definitely on LinkedIn. I am good at many things, but social media is not one of them. So, that you can find me to contact me there, but find information about me, not so great.
Which is exactly the opposite of what I do. I'm at MattPT55. As always, thanks so much for listening. Thank you both for sharing your expertise with us. And until next time, this has been Missed Apex Podcast.